History books are full of battles and glory, but they often leave out the weirdest, funniest, and downright absurd habits of the very military minds who shaped the world. From phantom pregnancies to tea parties in the middle of sieges, today you'll meet 44 commanders who proved you can win wars while being utterly, hilariously strange. Forget what you learned in school. This is history's blooper reel, and it's spectacular. 1. Prussian Field Marshal Blücher, a victor at Waterloo, didn't just beat Napoleon. He also beat common sense into a fine powder. At one point, he became completely convinced he was pregnant. Not just pregnant, but pregnant with an elephant. And, naturally, the father was a French soldier. He apparently ordered his staff to fetch hay and prepare for the blessed event. Imagine being the poor aide tasked with both planning a cavalry charge and finding a crib big enough for a baby elephant. "Sir, the enemy is advancing." "Quiet, I think I felt it kick." The man was trying to win a war while holding imaginary baby showers for himself. 2. Let's talk about the Danish nobleman and general Tycho Brahe. This dude's life was a sitcom waiting to happen. First, he lost his nose in a duel over a math equation and wore a fake brass one, which already puts him in the Hall of Fame. But it gets better. He kept a psychic court jester, a dwarf named Jep, who would sit under the dinner table during banquets and just shout prophecies at guests. And to top it all off, he owned a pet moose that met its end by getting drunk at a party and falling down the stairs. Imagine trying to plan a war while a psychic is yelling from under the table and a wasted moose is causing chaos. This was less a general's life and more a chaotic circus. 3. British General Orde Wingate wasn't just eccentric. He was a full-blown performance artist. He insisted on holding his staff meetings completely naked, while aggressively scrubbing himself with a stiff brush like he was a dirty floor. As if that didn't create enough of an awkward silence, he also snacked on raw onions like they were apples. His aides had to deliver reports while pretending not to gag on the smell of raw onion and pure, unfiltered weirdness. That's a man who looked at the horrors of war and thought, "You know what this needs? More nudity and bad breath." 4. King Charles VI of France, supreme commander of his armies, fully believed he was made of glass. Not metaphorically, he literally thought he was a delicate chandelier on legs. He wore iron rods sewn into his clothes to keep from breaking and would freak out if anyone got too close. His soldiers somehow kept fighting for a man who thought he'd shatter if you high-fived him too hard. One can only imagine the knights muttering, "We're dying for this guy? The one who won't sit on a normal chair in case it cracks him in two?" At least no one could accuse him of not being transparent with his fears. 5. General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was known for his iron nerves, but his internal logic was made of silly putty. He was completely convinced that one of his arms was heavier than the other and would hold it straight up in the air for long stretches to rebalance his blood. Even while leading a cavalry charge, there he'd be, riding with one arm sky high like he was at a rock concert trying to get the lead singer's attention. His soldiers respected him, but you can bet they also placed silent bets on how long before he just floated away like a lopsided balloon. 6. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered most of Europe but apparently couldn't conquer his own fear of your grandma's house cat. The man who stared down cannons would go pale and start sweating at the mere sight of a kitten. His enemies should have just launched cats over the walls with catapults. The war might have been over in an afternoon with a single terrified shriek. Just picture Napoleon fleeing the battlefield while some tiny ball of fluff sits there licking its paws, wondering what all the fuss is about. That's not just a phobia, that's history's cutest military defeat. 7. Ulysses S. Grant earned the nickname The Butcher for his relentless Civil War tactics, yet the man couldn't handle a rare steak. If his dinner was even a little pink inside, he'd push it away like it was a live grenade. He demanded his meat so overcooked it could probably be used to patch a hole in a tank. Here's a guy who watched entire battlefields turn red without flinching, but he sees a medium-rare steak and suddenly he's queasy. That's not a battle-hardened commander. That's just a guy who would be a total nightmare to take to a barbecue. 8. French General François, Duke of Vendôme, once risked his life in a duel over a duck. Not land, not honor, not love. A duck. He got into an argument with another nobleman about which of their ducks was more physically attractive, and next thing you know, they're out there with swords. The only thing more ridiculous would have been if the ducks themselves were the judges, holding up little scorecards. It proves that for some leaders, the biggest threats weren't invading armies, but a rival with a slightly hotter waterfowl. 9. Hannibal Barca, the mastermind who marched elephants over the Alps, was also one of history's most paranoid dudes. He collected wigs and disguises like they were Pokemon cards, absolutely convinced everyone was an assassin. He'd wander his own camp disguised as a bumbling peasant just to make sure nobody was plotting against him. His soldiers must have loved watching their brilliant commander stumble around in rags like he was in a really bad high school play called Suspicious Peasant No. 3. It's hard to be a military genius when you're also a master of terrible acting. 10. Genghis Khan struck terror into millions, unless it was storming outside. Turns out the great Khan was terrified of thunder. Every time a storm rolled in, the most feared conqueror in the world would scurry to his tent and hide like a small dog. His troops probably tried to look serious and comfort him, but you can bet they also snickered a little. Imagine an army of unstoppable warriors just having to pause their conquering because their boss was cowering under a blanket, hoping the big sky monster didn't notice him. 11. Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna didn't just lose his leg, he turned it into a celebrity. After it was amputated, he gave it a full-state funeral with cannons, marching soldiers, and tearful speeches, as if his foot alone had liberated the country. Crowds wept over what was essentially a fancy bone in a coffin. Years later, he'd even visit its grave and salute it like it was an old war buddy. Only Santa Anna could be upstaged by his own severed limb, and still act like he was the star of the show. 12. George Washington may have been the father of a nation, but his teeth were the stuff of nightmares. His dentures were an unholy Frankenstein's monster of hippo ivory, human teeth, and metal springs that squeaked and slipped constantly. He ranted about them in letters, and every speech was a high-stakes gamble against a tooth flying out mid-sentence. His jaw ached so badly he preferred to eat mush. America got its freedom, but George never got free from the daily horror show happening in his own mouth. 13. Frederick William Ferd of Prussia didn't just want tall soldiers. He was obsessed. He sent agents across Europe, bribing and kidnapping towering men for his Potsdam Giants regiment. Then he made them marry tall women to breed even bigger soldiers, turning his army into a bizarre human giraffe farm. He'd march through their ranks, beaming with pride at the forest of heads above him, while his generals quietly wondered if they were going to have to install higher doorways in the barracks. His dream of an army of skyscrapers never quite worked, but it was gloriously weird. 14. Daniel Sickles didn't just lose his leg at Gettysburg. He kept it as his weirdest, most loyal friend. He had it preserved in a museum, and every year on the battle's anniversary he'd visit it, sometimes bringing guests. He'd stand over the glass case, staring fondly at his own bones, reminiscing about the good old days when they were still attached. That's not just creepy, that's the longest and most awkward reunion tour in American history, starring one man and his own detached body part. 15. George Armstrong Custer approached war like it was the Met Gala. He wore custom black velvet uniforms and perfumed his golden hair with cinnamon oil, looking like a Christmas ornament on horseback charging into battle. His enemies must have paused, wondering if they should shoot him or ask for his decorator. Even when he lost everything, at least he made sure he died fabulously. Say what you want about his tactics. The man knew how to make a ridiculously fragrant exit. 16. Admiral Horatio Nelson was Britain's greatest naval hero, but he spent his career battling not just the French, but also his own stomach. The man who ruled the waves was, ironically, cripplingly seasick. Every time he set sail, he'd turn green, lean over the side, and then stand back up and command like nothing happened. His sailors learned to ignore the sight of their fearless leader retching between commands. It's hard to look intimidating while clutching your stomach and begging the sea to stop spinning, but somehow Nelson made it his brand. 17. The Duke of Wellington, who finally beat Napoleon, had a secret weapon even better than his army. He could fall asleep anywhere. Mid-battle, out like a light, on horseback, snoozing, in the middle of a war council, completely gone. His aides would have to poke him awake just to finish his sentences. He claimed it was for energy conservation, but his generals were never sure if their strategy meetings were just turning into nap time. Only Wellington could win wars while basically sleepwalking through them. 18. General Joseph fighting Joe. Hooker might have been a decent commander, but he was an even better party planner. His headquarters during the Civil War was so notorious for wild parties and a constant parade of women that many say his name became the slang term for prostitutes. Soldiers joked that the real battle was just keeping up with the parties at HQ. When he wasn't fighting the Confederates, he was hosting what looked like a 19th century frat house with cannons. His battlefield legacy might be blurry, but his parties? Legendary. 19. Alexander Suvorov, Russia's undefeated general, was equal parts military genius and complete lunatic. He refused to sleep in a proper bed, preferring hay on the floor like a farm animal. He woke up each morning by dumping buckets of ice water over his head and would crow like a rooster to get his soldiers out of bed. He even hopped around camp like a bird to keep his joints loose. His men must have wondered if he was brilliant or just completely unhinged. The answer was probably yes. 20. William Tecumseh Sherman wasn't known for his subtlety, and his temper didn't stop at enemy cities. Whenever a battle plan frustrated him, he'd slam the map on the ground and stomp all over it, yelling that he was crushing the enemy's strategy. His aides would stand there awkwardly, waiting for him to finish his tantrum before carefully picking up the crumpled, footprint-covered map. Few generals have ever been so committed to symbolic footwork. If rage were a tactic, Sherman would have won every war single-handedly. 21. George Crook brought 2 pet raccoons everywhere he went, even into battle. They'd scurry across maps, knock over ink bottles, and climb onto his lap while his officers tried to discuss tactics. Sometimes he'd pause a meeting just to scratch their bellies or feed them snacks. Were they mascots, good luck charms, or just Crook's strangest habit? No one knew for sure, but it sure kept morale high and thoroughly confused the enemy. His army became famous for fighting alongside the fluffiest troops in military history. 22. Albrecht von Wallenstein ran his entire army by the stars. Before every single move, he'd consult his personal astrologer, refusing to attack if Mercury was in retrograde or Saturn seemed grumpy that day. His soldiers learned not to even pack up camp until Sagittarius gave its divine blessing. To outsiders, it looked absurd. A massive army just sitting idle because the sky was in a bad mood. His foes must have been baffled by how his forces simply sat still, waiting for cosmic approval to finally go and cause some chaos. 23. Zhuge Liang won battles just by being incredibly chill. He'd ride to war in a plain little cart, casually fanning himself with feathers as chaos swirled all around him. His enemies would freeze, convinced he had some kind of genius trick up his sleeve. But really, he just liked the breeze. His serene pose worked like magic, making his opponents doubt themselves while he looked like he was on a casual picnic instead of in a fight. His troops thought it was brilliance. His enemies thought it was sorcery. In truth, probably just nerves of steel and a deep love of good theatrics. 24. Heinz Guderian's secret weapon was a stuffed toy tiger. The father of the Blitzkrieg carried it into every battle, propped proudly on his tank's dashboard like a furry little mascot. Soldiers even saluted it before charging forward. The man who terrified Europe somehow managed to do it while cuddling a plushie, proving that even in total war, everyone needs a little comfort. His tiger became as legendary as his tanks, and it left enemies wondering if their own commanders were underprepared simply because they lacked plush artillery. 25. Tomoyuki. Yamashita believed his stare could break armies. He'd practice it for hours in front of a mirror, convinced his infamous tiger's stare could crush his enemy's morale from a distance. His staff learned to avoid eye contact at all costs, terrified of fainting under its intensity. Whether it actually worked on his enemies is still debatable, but it certainly kept his own officers on their toes. If nothing else, Yamashita proved that psychological warfare starts with the whites of your eyes, and his were sharpened to a weapon all their own. 26. Georgy Zhukov insisted that his bed always be positioned to face the enemy, even during the most brutal nights of the Battle of Stalingrad. He claimed he liked to keep an eye on them, even while sleeping. His aides dutifully moved his cot each night to face the German lines, as if his snores alone could intimidate the Nazis into retreat. It didn't matter how cramped or destroyed the bunker was. If he couldn't glare at his enemy in his dreams, he just wasn't satisfied. That's a level of petty dedication that deserves a medal. 27. Edmund Allenby could command an army with a look and terrify them with a tantrum. Known as the Bull, he was famous for his volcanic temper, which could turn meetings into shouting matches. But just as suddenly, he'd calm down, adjust his jacket, and politely offer everyone tea as if nothing had happened. His aides lived in a constant state of emotional whiplash, never knowing if they were about to be yelled at or offered a biscuit. For Allenby, rage was just another way to clear the air before a nice cuppa. 28. Jean de Lattre de Tassigny brought new meaning to the phrase battle pig. The French general carried his pet pig Nénette everywhere during World War II, claiming she brought him luck. Soldiers grew used to seeing her trotting through the mud beside his jeep, sometimes even squealing during parades. Officers quietly wondered if their orders had to be approved by the pig too. Nénette became a mascot in her own right, proving that sometimes a little pork can go a long way in boosting morale. 29. Ambrose Burnside might have been a mediocre general, but he was a true pioneer of facial hair. His lush, bushy strips of cheek fur connected to his mustache, leaving his chin clean-shaven, a style so outrageous it became known as sideburns, named after him. Even his enemies reportedly admired his grooming, which was arguably more successful than his battlefield maneuvers. His soldiers may have lost battles, but at least they served under the most stylish whiskers in American history. 30. King Ludwig II of Bavaria commanded an army but preferred commanding a dinner party of ghosts. He would throw these lavish banquets in his fairy tale castles for his guests, like Marie Antoinette and Louis XIV, holding full, booming conversations with the empty chairs around the table. His generals would stand by awkwardly as their commander toasted ghosts with fine wine and debated dessert options with the heir. It wasn't just eccentricity, it was a royal masterclass in completely ignoring reality. 31. Douglas Haig was as superstitious as he was stubborn. Before every major battle, he clutched his beloved lucky cane like it was the mythical sword Excalibur, refusing to let it out of his hand. Even as shells fell and men screamed around him, he'd be standing there gripping his special stick, convinced it held the key to victory. His troops joked that the cane was the real commander and Haig was just its bodyguard. If morale counted for anything, his soldiers followed orders partly out of respect, and partly out of fear he'd whack them with it if they didn't. 32. Paul von Hindenburg believed in discipline, the fatherland, and his daily coffee ritual. No matter how dire the battle or how urgent the reports of advancing enemies, he would pause everything at 4 p.m. sharp for a cup of coffee with cream. His generals could be in a full-blown panic, his army could be in retreat, yet he'd sit there calmly sipping his brew as though the world could wait. His officers learned quickly. You do not interrupt the field marshal's coffee. The war could wait 5 minutes for his creamy little slice of sanity. 33. Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia brought a surprising advisor into every meeting, his pet goat. This little creature wandered freely through his headquarters, chewing on maps, knocking over ink pots, and generally making a mess while generals tried to discuss serious tactics. But Selassie swore the goat brought him luck, maybe even more than his human advisors. His men just shrugged and accepted it. After all, how do you question a man who apparently lets livestock weigh in on national war plans? You don't. You just hope the goat doesn't eat your orders. 34. Yi Sun-sin, Korea's greatest admiral, never set sail without consulting the I Ching. Before every single naval engagement, he'd throw coins or yarrow sticks and spend hours reading the cryptic messages from the ancient Book of Changes. His officers waited anxiously for his verdict, watching him nod solemnly to a pile of sticks like it was delivering divine, infallible instructions. The enemy might have had more ships, but Yi had his magic 8-ball, and he was convinced that was all he needed. 35. Emperor Nero had all the power in the world, but what he really wanted was to be a rock star. He would force his top generals and senators to attend his endless lyre concerts, and he'd lock the doors so no one could leave. The performances dragged on for hours, with many faking fainting spells or even their own deaths just to be carried out. His soldiers probably feared another night of Nero's screeching strings more than they feared the enemy. The man might have been emperor of Rome, but on stage, he ruled as the tyrant of terrible music. 36. Richard the Lionheart may have been a legendary warrior, but his temper could definitely outmatch his sword. During the long and frustrating siege of Acre, he got so fed up with the castle wall's stubbornness that he reportedly just started biting them. Yes, the King of England himself gnawed on stones like an angry medieval beaver. His knights must have watched in baffled silence, wondering if they should join in or just quietly back away from their rabid monarch. That's a level of frustration most of us can't even imagine. 37. Ivan Chernyakhovsky, a brilliant Soviet general, had a habit of carrying a tiny toy pistol right next to his real one. He called it his secret weapon, and no one dared question him as he strode through battlefields with a plastic cap gun on his belt. His men probably figured if their commander could win major wars while armed like a mischievous child, then who were they to argue? His enemies never got to see his secret move, but his own troops probably giggled about it for years. That's how you keep morale high. 38. Oda Nobunaga was absolutely ruthless in war, but surprisingly refined when it came to his tea. In the midst of brutal military campaigns, he would literally pause everything to hold formal, serene tea ceremonies, complete with delicate cups and quiet contemplation. His soldiers would be waiting with swords drawn while their lord was busy sipping matcha and admiring the foam. The enemy could be charging, yet Nobunaga remained perfectly calm, proving there's always time for a little zen, even if your castle is currently on fire. 39. King Charles the Stound of Sweden was fearless on the battlefield and apparently completely oblivious to the concept of soap. He famously wore the same filthy uniform, boots and all, for weeks on end, even sleeping in it. His soldiers claimed you could smell him coming long before you saw him. Whether it was extreme discipline or just sheer stubbornness, Charles weaponized his personal odor long before chemical warfare was officially invented. And judging by his victories, it seemed to work just fine. 40. George Armstrong Custer didn't just want to win battles. He wanted to smell festive while doing it. Before every fight, he would perfume his long blonde hair with cinnamon oil, making him smell like a holiday dessert even in the middle of a gunfight. Soldiers around him joked you could follow the scent of cinnamon and find Custer ready to charge. His enemies must have been completely baffled, wondering if they were about to be attacked by a general or a giant, angry gingerbread man on a horse. 41. The Duke of Wellington didn't just nap, he weaponized it. He could fall asleep mid-conversation, mid-battle, or even mid-horseback ride. His officers never knew if their war council would suddenly turn into a snorefest as he drifted off while they spoke. Some claimed he dreamed up his best strategies during these catnaps, but most suspected he just really liked sleeping. Still, no one dared wake him, because somehow his bizarre napping schedule didn't stop him from beating Napoleon and changing the course of European history. 42. Douglas MacArthur made his iconic corncob pipe more famous than most movie stars. It was oversized, cartoonishly dramatic, and became his trademark on and off the battlefield. Reporters couldn't get enough of it, and his enemies reportedly thought he was smoking a piece of old plumbing. But the funniest part? Insiders said he barely ever actually smoked it. The pipe was just for show, a giant prop to make him look like the world's most thoughtful and stylish military hero. MacArthur proved you don't need to light up to burn your image into history. 43. Let's talk about a man who took his job home with him, literally. The famous lawman and part-time General Wyatt Earp apparently had a habit of trying to arrest people in his sleep. His wife said he would suddenly sit bolt upright in bed in the middle of the night and start shouting things like, "You're under arrest," at the empty darkness. You have to feel sorry for his wife. Forget nightmares about monsters. She had to deal with a husband who was trying to put the bedpost in handcuffs every single night. 44. And let's end with George S. Patton. We know he believed in reincarnation, but his belief went deep into the weird zone. He didn't just think he was a Roman soldier. He claimed he could remember the specific, mundane details like the design of the spear he carried and how terrible the food rations were. He'd tell these stories with a dead serious look on his face to anyone who would listen. It's one thing to be a history buff. It's another thing entirely to believe you are the history book. That's a level of confidence you just can't teach. So, which of these bizarre battlefield quirks blew your mind the most? And which general do you think would have made the worst roommate? Drop your answer in the comments below, and don't just lurk like a shy soldier. I want to see arguments, debates, and chaos down there worthy of a Napoleonic charge. If you laughed, learned, or both, hit that like button and subscribe, unless you're afraid your reincarnated self will regret missing more historical madness.